Hi, everyone. I'm your learner. Welcome to the Civil Discourse Project. The Civil Discourse Project is a video podcast aimed at promoting civil and respectful conversation about hot button, current contested issues between people with opposing views on those issues. It is not a formal debate. It is not an excuse or an avenue to attack people that you disagree with. It is simply an exercise in conversation and civil, respectful discourse. This week's topic is the BDS movement and whether or not it is really anti-Semitic in its nature, or if it is as legitimate a boycott as any other nation's boycott would be. Presenting the conservative side of the issue, we have Avi Mechanic, and presenting the liberal side of the issue, we have Nick Barak. I want to remind you both that I will be moderating to a certain extent. I will raise my hand like this if I feel that the conversation is becoming less respectful than it should be, or if we are going off topic, or if somebody is speaking for a very long time without letting the other participant have their say. Avi, can we start with you, and you can just tell us in one sentence why you decided to take part in this project and a little bit about who you are.
Well, you asked me, so I'm very happy to be here. A little bit about myself. 40 years old, married, 3 kids, live in the city of Modine, not too far away from you, actually. Was in the Army for a few good years, in the U.S. Army. Spent time working with the Multinational Forces and Observers, a peacekeeping unit in the Sinai Peninsula. Have a little bit of experience on issues here in the Middle East. I guess growing up, I grew up in a very liberal community in the U.S. I went to a liberal university, and I was exposed to a lot of these viewpoints, in particular with Israel, and it was always troubling when liberals would openly criticize Israel to the point that it was disproportionate to the level of criticism that we would see directed towards other countries. I feel passionate about issues that affect Israel, especially affect Israel in an international public diplomacy standpoint. And these are issues that we as Jews and we as Israelis need to constantly stand up. We need to constantly fight for those beliefs and fight for those ideas. And when we come across something like BDS, a terrible, anti-Semitic, hateful ideology, then we need to stand strong and we need to call it for what it is, which is a really terrible anti-Semitic movement that creates basically a safe zone for anti-Semites to spew their hatred towards Israel under the clout of legitimate criticism towards the state of Israel, which it certainly isn't.
All right, thanks, Avi. Nick, can you, in just a sentence or two, tell us who you are and why you're taking part in this project?
Sure. My name is Nick. I made Aliyah around 4 years ago in 2016. And while I still have the Zionist ideals that I did when I first made Aliyah, I felt that in my interaction with Israelis, with American Jews who also made Aliyah, that there's a certain amount of bubble thinking that I wasn't exposed to because I grew up in the United States. I was in a secular environment, still with a strong Jewish identity, but not quite the sort of Dati, very strongly Zionist upbringing that many people who make Aliyah have. And I feel like one of the problems with calling BDS anti-Semitic is it doesn't create conversation. It simply imposes the Zionist right-wing narrative on the entire conflict. And if anyone deviates from that, anti-Semitism could be used as a tool to essentially call any position that they don't like unacceptable. It could be BDS or it could be other forms of criticism of Israel. And I don't feel like it's a good way to handle the conflict. I don't think it's a way of intellectually honestly debating the issue.
Okay. Before we get into it, we're going to get further into this conversation, but Avi, can we just dive straight in more by, can you just give us a more in-depth view of why you believe that BDS really is anti-Semitic in its nature? Because there are many that would say that it's not, and it's, you know, just as legitimate as anything else. So can you give us a little bit more of a take on that?
Listen, don't take it from me. You can take it from some of the some individuals, not left-wing individuals, but some people on the hard left, individuals such as Amira Haas, correspondent for Haaretz, Norman Finkelstein, uh, you know, someone who is not exactly an Israel lover, has stated quite unequivocally that you know, people that believe in BDS really need to be honest about what they're spewing, and what they're spewing is really you know, what is the end game of BDS? Okay, now we talked about legitimate criticism. Nick said, you know, when you call someone an anti-Semite, it destroys the level of conversation. I don't have a problem debating with someone on the left side, someone who's, you know, let's open the book here. I'm a Likud member. And I support the current government, but I would not go out and call someone who is on the left side of the political spectrum an anti-Semite. Where I draw the line is when your end game, the final end game of BDS, is the elimination of the state of Israel. When it goes to that level, that's anti-Semitic. Now, if you want to have an argument about issues, and you want to criticize us, I criticize Israel. Everyone on this panel criticizes Israel one way or another. But when you're obsessed and when that focus is only on Israel, which is what BDS does. BDS doesn't focus on Syria, which is about a 4-hour drive from here, where they've killed about 1 million Syrians in the Syrian civil war. That is never discussed. Iran calling for genocide against Israel on a daily basis and building atomic weapons to use it against us is not discussed at BDS. What is discussed at BDS is the economic starvation of the state of Israel. And to use the apartheid model, one could argue if that was effective or not against South Africa. There are many who would say it wasn't effective, but they want to take that apart. They want to take that boycotting apartheid model from South Africa and replicate it to Israel. When you call Israel an apartheid state, that's not a legitimate argument anymore. That is a lie. There's a difference between defaming someone and having an opposing viewpoint. And when you get to the point of defamation, you know, that's, then you got to call it out for what it is, a lie. In the case of BDS, anti-Semitic.
Okay, so I have basically 2 points. Maybe I'll hit the first. The idea that a boycott movement or any sort of criticism of any country has to be proportionate. I know people just anecdotally that are what you would call obsessed with certain countries. They are obsessed with Iran. They're obsessed with Russia. They're obsessed with China. And each individual person has their own personal reason for it. An example of this is a few years ago, Russia passed an anti-gay propaganda law, which basically prevented LGBT people in Russia from protesting for gay rights. And there were liberals in the United States who boycotted that. Around the same time in North Carolina, there was a transgender bill passed that people felt was discriminatory. And actually businesses in America boycotted a state, and other states boycotted North Carolina. Now, that was disproportionate. If you think of all of the violations of LGBT rights in the world, those 2 cases that I just gave are not at all at the top of the list in terms of offenders. You gave the example of Iran. The fact is that on Iran, there have been sanctions since the 1979, since the Islamic Revolution, where even today, Iranians are not able to get medical supplies in the middle of Corona because of the sanctions on their country. So again, the idea that it's disproportionate or there are no parallels, not everyone bases their opinions by compiling a perfectly logical, perfectly coherent list of worst offenders to least offenders. I don't know anyone who operates that way. And so to actually put that expectation, I think that's a double standard.
I don't have a problem with legitimate boycotts. Legitimate boycotts are, you know, we live in a, for the most part, if I refer to Israel or to the United States, we live in a democratic world. Boycotts are justified. I have never heard of a boycott movement, though, that has called for the elimination of a state, the genocide of a people, which is what BDS calls for. The boycotts that you have listed were generally temporary boycotts to, change a policy, to reverse a policy, to amend a policy. Whatever boycotts have occurred in other countries throughout, and we can also discuss the effectiveness of the boycott, which is not very effective. And thank God, BDS has done. If BDS has done anything, and which is unfortunate, it's probably hurt Palestinians more than it's hurt Israelis. And BDS isn't even a blip in terms of Israel's economic success. We are an incredibly strong country, and BDS hasn't affected that one iota. And thank God, not because of me or not because, but because of some very smart people who've been working hard for many, many years to ensure that BDS doesn't gain a foothold anywhere in the world. Legitimate boycott, go for it. I don't have a problem with it. I think it's ineffective, but when the boycott movement calls for the elimination of your country, then it's no longer legitimate. It goes from legitimate to racist. And you have to identify it for that.
Okay, so I agree with you that boycotts generally don't work. I think if you look at sanctions against Iran or sanctions against Cuba, the reason why they've been maintained for so long and haven't actually toppled those regimes is because the people tend to sort of back their leaders when they feel like they're under attack against an external enemy. So I agree with you. In general, it's not an effective method, but the question isn't whether it's effective, it's whether it's anti-Semitic. So on the point that you've made and many advocates make that this is a movement to destroy Israel, and then you said just now that it's genocide. First of all, I think we should clarify what exactly we think the goal of BDS is. As far as I understand, BDS is a way to boycott, that advocate for companies to divest, and have governments sanction Israel in order for it to implement certain policies. So in some cases, that could be to enter into negotiations for a two-state solution. But generally, the BDS goal, the end goal, as far as I understand it, is to have basically a one-state solution where the Palestinians and Israelis all have equal rights. Now, Israeli advocates say, well, this will effectively end Israel. But to call it genocide, I think indicates to me that maybe you have another understanding of what BDS is. Can you just agree with my characterization?
No, I disagree with the characterization because the end goal of BDS is a one-state solution with the Palestinian right, so-called right of return, which would end Israel as a Jewish state. And if we take a look at history, there's historical context with what has happened throughout Jewish communities when we have become a minority, or more importantly, when a population such as the Palestinian population, whose ideology is bent on the elimination of Israel. You have to be living on another planet to think if we would do a Palestinian right of return and all the Palestinians would come back to live in Israel, that we would live in one big kumbaya. This would be a reckoning, and the end goal would be the elimination of Israel. And we would become effectively dhimmis, which, if we understand the historical context of what that wasn't exactly a great time for Jews to live under. So, it's way over the edge of what a legitimate boycott is. And and the funny thing about this is not a lot of Palestinians support BDS. Palestinians want they want an economic relationship with Israel. The Palestinian people survive because of that economic relationship. And there's precedence for this, right? We've had diplomatic arguments with countries throughout the world. We've had severely bad relations with some of our neighbors, but we've always maintained an economic relationship. So when you call for an economic starvation of a country because you want to change a country's policies, in effect, ending that country's existence as a state, then BDS simply becomes another extension of the Palestinian war on terror, the Palestinian war of terrorism that's been initiated on Israel for the past 100 years. They couldn't defeat us on territory. When they surprise attacked us in 1973, that didn't work. They launched an oil boycott against the United States. That didn't work. And then they had the so-called Durban Peace Conference in 2005, when they said, look, we're going to economically boycott Israel. It is another extension of their ideology, which calls for the destruction of the state of Israel. Pure and simple. You just listen to Omar Barghouti, the founder of the BDS movement. He calls for Palestinian right of return, a one-state solution, and a one-state solution, Nick, you know this as well as I do. When you call for a one-state solution, that is coded diplomatic language for the elimination of the state of Israel.
Well, initially you said the Palestinians don't support it, but then you presented it as the long-term Palestinian plan to destroy Israel. So I'm not sure. I don't know how relevant it is. My basis for it isn't whether the Palestinians support it or not. My basis for saying it isn't anti-Semitic is just the allegation that to call for equal rights for the Palestinians, that's a form of racism, to me, fails to get into the mind of the average person who advocates for BDS. If we're talking about a European who's a far left activist, the idea that that's racism sort of flips the definition. Even the allegation that this is destroying Israel is flipping the definition of that term upside down. If you take someone like Jeremy Corbyn, to just take a tangible example, there's no British policy in terms of foreign policy, historical, present, that he supports. He supported the IRA, which is a terrorist organization, or he was sympathetic to it, even after having killed several members of the British Parliament and members of the royal family. He's harshly critical of American foreign policy. He opposed Britain's war in the Falklands. So there's virtually no policy that he objects to in Israel that he wouldn't apply to himself. And any suggestion that in Britain there has to be some sort of ethnic or religious test in order to become a British citizen, those leftists who support BDS would find it completely objectionable in Britain. So I don't understand how you can say that a European who's looking at the situation and sees that the basis for the conflict in their mind is, one, the fact that the Palestinians were driven from the land and have remained refugees and want to return to their homeland. And the other basis for it is that Israel has been controlling them and refusing to grant them citizenship. To the European, again, this isn't from my perspective, this isn't from your perspective. They don't understand the sort of Jewish nationalism. That's what Zionism is. They don't understand the nationalism based on ethnic and religious grounds that we believe in. So explain it from a Corbynist perspective why it's anti-Semitic or why it's any different than those other situations.
I actually want to continue a little bit on what you were saying, just because we did bring up Zionism and what is the core tenet of that. A lot of BDS supporters take this angle that they are anti-Zionist, they are not anti-Semitic. Where do you think the line is drawn where you can say, okay, yeah, the BDS movement, it might be anti-Zionist, but it's not anti-Semitic when we're talking about a country that is the only Jewish country? How do you draw that line?
This question is for me or for others?
Yeah, for you, Nick, please.
Okay. So the fact that Israel is the only Jewish state, to me, wouldn't affect the calculation of people like Jeremy Corbyn or people on the left in Europe, because they're not thinking in sorts of ethnic nationalist terms. If you sort of apply the exact same definition of destroy to Sweden, the fact is Sweden has been destroyed because Sweden does not define itself as the homeland exclusively of ethnic Swedes or Christians. They're one of the countries that took in a very high proportion of refugees in recent years. So to say that Israel is somehow being unfairly targeted because it's a Jewish state and being asked to modify its sort of immigration policy and its national ethos in order to resolve a conflict. They didn't make up the conflict. It's actually been happening. It's been a very long-standing conflict in the Middle East. Um, I don't think it even enters their mind. Sweden is the only Swedish state in the world. China is the only Chinese state in the world. Um, I don't know why it's necessarily relevant that there's one Jewish state as opposed to one Iranian state, one whatever state.
Go ahead, Avi, if you want to respond.
Look, there's a historical precedent of why severe focus on Israel being a Jewish state is important for Jews throughout the world. Sweden does not have to fight for physical existence. China, while they had a terrible history, did not have to fight for physical existence. This country that has been independent since 1948, I don't think has known a day when we have not been threatened with annihilation. We have engaged in multiple peace treaties. We have gone above and beyond, I think, any other Western country in the world with our own initiatives to end the conflict between us and the Palestinians. For there to be an economic movement to say you're not doing enough, for there to be an economic movement saying your so-called settlement policies are not acceptable to us, to create an economic boycott movement and say that, you know, the capital that you have labeled as your capital, the city of Jerusalem, it's not really your capital. This goes back to historical precedents in Europe when Jews were told you couldn't live in certain areas, you couldn't build in certain areas. Uh, and we see the same thing happening in Israel today. And with all due respect, I don't really give credence to what, you know, a European liberal might think towards Israel. European liberals have been quite unkind to Jews in the past, and they're certainly unkind to Israel today. What I do know is I know that there's difference between a legitimate boycott movement that goes to change a certain policy between a boycott movement that calls for not just for us to change certain policies as you might describe it towards the Palestinians, but yes, for us to change our entire national fabric, for us to no longer be a Jewish state, that ends the existence of the Jewish state, which in effect, ending the Jewish state ends the Jewish people. There is no Jewish people without a state of Israel. And the economic boycott, the BDS movement, calls for the end of the Jewish state by telling Jews you cannot have a homeland, you cannot have a capital, you cannot build in certain areas of your country. It is 100% anti-Semitic. No one is telling the Swedes, no one is telling the English, no one is telling the Chinese where they can build, where they can't build. No one disputes the fact that London is the capital of England or, you know, any other capital throughout the world. We are the only country in the world that we have a disputed capital, to the point that enlightened liberals in the United States and in the European Union would go so far to initiate an economic boycott for us to change policies because they don't like those policies and they want us to change the complete fabric of our country towards the elimination of a Jewish state. I don't know what else you would call that. I mean, you got to be honest about this movement, and this movement, even members of this movement who have left this movement are saying, look, you got to be honest. This movement is about the destruction of Israel, and there's a reason why even Germany comes out and criticizes BDS and says, look, this is anti-Semitic. And while I might have a lot of disagreements with the Germans, I think the Germans probably have a pretty good understanding of what anti-Semitism is, and when they see it, they identified it many years back. And many countries, even, you know, you can go to France, and in France, if you initiate legal proceeding, if you call for a boycott of Israel, the French state can initiate legal proceedings against you. I mean, there are some countries throughout the world where they have actually recognized that boycotting the single Jewish state in the world is akin to anti-Semitism. Criticism towards Israel, fine. I accept criticism, and we will fight that criticism. We can argue that criticism. But to say we're going to economically starve you, and unless you change the fabric of your country, that goes beyond the pale of a relevant boycott movement.
Okay, so you mixed in the beginning of what you said. You mixed a few things together. Criticizing Israel for building in the West Bank or for designating Jerusalem as its capital is a more expansive criticism than simply what BDS specifically calls for. Lots of just center-left politicians or even center-right politicians in Europe and around the world. I don't know. I think Israelis have a tendency to focus on Europe because in our mind, we're still sort of in Europe. But I think if you look at any country in the world, most countries in the world, with the exception of the United States and a few small countries that back Israel at the UN, most countries criticize Israel for settlement expansion. So we're conflating a few different things. I could explain to you why Sweden isn't criticized for building wherever it builds, whereas Israel does, but I feel like that's veering into a different conversation. Um, the other point you made, um, well, you made a few points about how even Norman Finkelstein and France and Germany are coming out and saying that BDS is anti-Semitic. Um, are we just sort of are we just making the claim that whatever is the most popular view is the correct view? I'm not sure what you're trying to get with that, especially since you don't find the views of the left wing in Europe or the United States to be particularly credible on this issue anyway. There are certain reasons why France and Germany would consider BDS to be anti-Semitic. Germany, because it has a great amount of guilt over the Holocaust, so it goes out of its way to try to protect its image and to have a relationship with Israel that is friendlier. France, I'm not 100% sure, but France in general has much more strict rules on free speech, the kinds that the United States doesn't have. So Holocaust denial is also illegal in France and other forms of racism. But that to me doesn't necessarily indicate that France concluded correctly. They could have concluded incorrectly. So I'm not sure why that's relevant. Should we poll every European? Like, I'm not sure what the criteria is.
We don't need to poll every single European. What we can do is we can take a look at the mainstream politics of a lot of these countries. And I'll use the United States, since the United States is the most important ally of the state of Israel. Both Democrats and I'm a Donald Trump supporter. I'm a proud Republican, but Democrats and Republicans on both sides of the aisle have unequivocally stated that BDS is it's an anti-Semitic movement. There's no argument. The only person I think in the United States who might argue that BDS is not an anti-Semitic movement is Ilhan Omar. So if you're gonna take your talking points from Ilhan Omar, that's fine, But say I stand with Ilhan Omar and Rashida Tlaib, two hardcore anti-Semitic Democrats in the United States who have been criticized on both sides of the political aisle in the United States. So what I'm saying is, mainstream politics in reasonable countries have concluded that this is a anti-Semitic movement targeted towards the state of Israel. And you have to go searching pretty far into the extreme areas of the left and the extreme areas of the right also, right? Because usually the extreme right and the extreme left have this kind of this convergence when it comes to boycotting Israel.
So a few points. Again, there are lots of political pressures that determine countries' policies. I saw a poll, and I was actually surprised by it. It's way higher than I expected, but something like 20%. In another poll, I saw 30% of Americans support BDS. I think it has to do with the way the question was framed, because that seems way too high to me. But again, the fact is that there isn't much debate about BDS in the United States. It's something that American Jews are very passionate about, but the average person probably has no idea about this movement, and so they can't coherently form an opinion on it. But my question though is, okay, one, how is it intellectually inconsistent for a leftist in Europe, the example I gave of Jeremy Corbyn, to oppose Israel when he himself finds any form of discriminatory immigration policy, any form of nationalism, religious chauvinism to be absolutely unacceptable? Why is it inconsistent for him to say the same thing about Israel? And number two, do you think that what is the fundamental distinction between a Palestinian who doesn't support Israel's right to exist and thinks all the land should be theirs versus an Israeli or an American Jew who believes in Eretz Yisrael Shlema, that all the land should be ours and the Palestinians shouldn't have a say in their own governance? What is the fundamental distinction that makes one anti-Semitic, and therefore we have to have this extra word for it, and the exact same parallel that is maybe an extreme position, maybe you would agree with it, but it's perfectly acceptable. What is the fundamental distinction?
Well, if you use the example of Jeremy Corbyn, this is a far leftist British politician who, was pictured with Hafez al-Assad, the dictator of Syria, pictured with Saddam Hussein. This is a man that really had no problems calling Hamas members or Hezbollah members his dear friends. To me, that I call that an extremist. When you say my good friends or members of Hezbollah, and you're willing to pose in a photo with Hafez al-Assad and Saddam Hussein, I think your legitimacy as someone who supports enlightened democracy kind of takes a back seat.
No, but my question is, why is it different? Considering all his politics, considering Britain, considering the US, considering the West generally, why is it inconsistent? He's generally opposed to, he's generally friendly towards enemies of the West, which Israel is part of. So why is that? Why are we creating an extra word for his antagonism towards Israel, but not an extra word that implies some sort of ethnic or visceral hatred of Brits or anyone else, Americans, French? Why are we creating this extra word? What's the relevance of it? How does it help us?
I'm not interested in the convergence of a certain person's ideological beliefs. I mean, if you support a boycott against a Jewish state, and you call Hezbollah members your friends, and you pose with the Syrian dictator, and you pose with the Iraqi dictator, at the end, if it walks like a duck and it looks like a duck and it quacks like a duck, at the end of the day, you got to call it a duck. If it's an anti-Semite, it's an anti-Semite. What his positions with the IRA? He was a supporter of the IRA. Supporters of the IRA assisted the PLO against Israel. Some of the top PLO members were trained in Ireland. Ireland is in fact, a hotbed of Palestinian activism. There are Palestinians in Israel who want to have a good life, and I don't have a problem with that. There are Palestinians who, I would say about 50-60% of Palestinians who live in Israel want to, for the most part, would like to see Israel disappear. 30-40% know that their economic existence has to do with a strong state of Israel. If you were to poll Palestinians living in East Jerusalem, most of them would want to live under Israeli sovereignty. A person's domestic political beliefs it's not of interest to me personally. What is of interest to me is when you call yourself a so-called liberal enlightened person, and you pose and you support and you advocate for some of the worst awful dictators in the world, and then on top of that you say, that little tiny democracy in the Middle East, that little tiny state the size of New Jersey, we have a problem with this little tiny state the size of New Jersey, because there's about 6-7 million Jews there, but we don't have a problem with the 300-400 million Arabs in the Middle East that are, you have a civil war in Syria, you've got Iran, you've got Iraq, you've got Egypt, serial human rights abusers. They are completely left alone, but we're going to focus on this little tiny speck the size of New Jersey. Then you have a serious problem. And we call that anti-Semitism.
So,
guys, I just want to give a 5-minute warning. Okay. So Nick, why don't you complete some thoughts, and then Avi very quickly, and then we got to wrap things up.
okay, so again, I'm not supporting Jeremy Corbyn. I would never vote for him. I just am saying that it's perfectly consistent with his worldview to advocate for the things he advocates. What anti-Semitism is, what the claim basically means, is the view is so outrageous that the only way you could possibly justify it is by believing that it has to be rooted in some sort of deep visceral hatred for Jewish people. And it seems to me like you can't explain any of his views So how is his objection to Israel any different? The way you made it sound is his support for the IRA or other policies is rooted in his anti-Semitism, and that's a stretch. The IRA is not about pro-Palestinian. That's not the fundamental reason for existence. It was physical violence against Britain and other Irish people in Northern Ireland. So again, explain to yourself, maybe we don't have time now, how a person might hold those views and why you have to sort of conclude that it has to be anti-Semitism when clearly you don't understand so much about this person's worldview or just find it completely nuts all around. So I don't understand again why the focus has to be on this one thing we want to call anti-Semitism. What about anti-Americanism, anti-Britishism? Why is only anti-Semitism the thing we could cancel him for? And again, the question I asked was, what's the fundamental difference between people who believe that all of the land belongs to us on the Israeli side and the exact same people on the other side? Why is it different? If I believe that we should continue building, we should never grant the Palestinians rights, you would not say that I'm a terrible person, I need to be silenced, I cannot be countenanced in polite company. So why is the exact same parallel acceptable when we're talking about the other side?
It's an easy parallel to make because the creation of a Jewish state, the only democracy in the Middle East, is the only country in the Middle East that really gives Palestinians and Arabs the full democratic rights. So anyone who calls or advocates for the belief of a greater Israel, they are not advocating for a genocide or for the elimination of the Palestinian people. These are people
I don't know if
who
a
want
right
the
wing
people who
that
want it.
supports
I didn't. I
annexation
didn't. No, I didn't.
that
There,
wants to
look.
grant
There's extremists on both sides. I can't claim to speak for everyone, but what
not
I can claim is that the national fabric of Israel is a democratic fabric. It is a democratic state that Arabs have the best democratic rights than even any other Arab country in the Middle East. A greater
which
Israel.
wants to grant the Palestinians full citizenship.
I'm sorry.
Which Likud MK wants to grant the Palestinians full citizenship. The Palestinians in the territories, not the Israeli Arabs.
Uh, I have no problems with granting Arabs that live, Palestinian Arabs who wish to remain loyal to the state of Israel should be granted citizenship. My claim to this is that a boycott against Israel, the only Jewish state in the Middle East, is clearly an anti-Semitic movement, and I would also say that Jew hatred or outright anti-Semitism, calling someone a dirty Jew, it's not politically correct. People really don't talk like this anymore. I mean, you have extremists on both sides. What has become really politically incorrect has become mainstream under the cloud of Israel, of legitimate Israel criticism. And what happens is that, you can have anti-Semites on the left and right, and what they've done is they have taken the cloud of legitimate criticism against Israel, and they say, you know what? We can't really be in your face anti-Semitic now, but what we can do is we can call for an economic boycott and we can starve the Jewish state. And that is how we can best express our deep hatred to the Jewish people. They'll never say it. They'll never say, I hate Jewish people. But calling for an economic boycott against the one and only Jewish state in the Middle East that gives full democratic rights to its Arab citizens, it's hard to conclude anything differently.
All right. Thanks, guys. Before we wrap up, I know this was kind of heated and charged, and everybody feels definitely very passionately about your stances. But that being said, I really would like to hear from both of you if you felt like this conversation was productive, if you felt like it did remain civil, if you feel like you found common ground, and if not, do you feel like you're still in a position where you can walk away agreeing to disagree and still maintaining respect for each other? Avi, why don't we start with you?
Every Jew is my brother and my sister. We can have our disagreements, but I never I spend a good part of my life never taking anything too seriously. So I try not to take it too seriously, and I try not to take it to heart. But the most important thing, really the most important thing about BDS, and really the most significant thing about BDS, is that it has had no impact on Israel, and thank God for that. I respect Nick, respect his views. I think he's wrong, but I respect him. And if you're ever in Modin, on a Shabbat walking around the Deanery buildings, you might see a guy walking around with a bottle of L'chaim, and that'll be me.
All right, Nick, how about you?
Yeah, look, in general, Avi's views to me are not something that I'm unfamiliar with. I live in Israel. I probably have the minority view among myself and my peers. And his perspective is a perfectly legitimate one. But I think that he's wrong, which is fine. But we can still have a friendly, not so friendly at times, but overall friendly conversation.
Can I just do a public service? March 23rd is elections in Israel. Please go out and vote. Very important. If you want to make an impact for us who came from America, if you want to make an impact in the Jewish state, go out and vote. Very important.
Thanks, Avi. That goes without saying that it's for anyone, right? Just vote.
I don't want to get in trouble.
Voting we could.
All right.
Nick is right.
Thank you guys so much for joining me. I really appreciate it. Why don't you guys exit and I'll wrap things up. Thanks a lot. Okay, so that was definitely a charged conversation. I guess is the nicest way to say it. Although I do really have to give them credit. I do think that they really did manage to keep things civil and respectful as much as possible. I don't know how many of you are paying attention. This is our third show. And I definitely did not jump in this time as much as I have in the last two episodes. And it's not because I didn't even have what to say or I didn't have anything prepared. I actually had quite a few questions that I had planned on throwing out there. But I really feel like Avi and Nick both really kind of took it to places that they felt strongly about. They definitely did get a little bit off topic, and I debated in my own head whether or not to step in. The reason I didn't is because it happens to be that we chose this topic a little while ago. And just over the weekend, as I'm sure many of you know, the ICC came out with this decision saying that they have jurisdiction to probe and try Israel for war crimes. While it's not specifically the BDS movement, I do feel that there's a lot of parallel in terms of the motivation behind it and the movements behind it. And for that reason only, I did feel like a general conversation about anti-Semitism versus anti-Zionism and, the attitudes behind them. I did feel like it was relevant to discuss, even if we did veer slightly away specifically from BDS. I do feel like those are important conversations to have and certainly topical. As for my own views, I think it goes without saying, I absolutely believe that the BDS movement is anti-Semitic in its nature. I think you'd be hard pressed. In fact, Nick, he said himself, he knows that he's a minority, certainly within his own circles. I think when you have a movement that is so widely, described by people across the aisle, across countries, this movement is being called anti-Semitic by people who generally don't agree on a lot of the same issues. Certainly when it comes to Israel, I think you really have to sit up and pay attention. At this point, we're living in a time, Avi actually mentioned, where, the anti-Semitism of old is not politically correct anymore. It's just not something that you hear a lot. Not to say that it doesn't exist, obviously, but you're not going to hear things like dirty Jew or we hate the Jews in Congress, for example. You will hear a lot about how criticism of Israel is legitimate. And any movement that seeks to criticize Israel is legitimate. While free speech and criticism of any government is certainly legitimate, I certainly, even as a right winger, I certainly have been critical of the Israeli government in the last few months, that's for sure. When you single out the only Jewish state, a state that exists to be a haven for Jews, not even getting into history and Bible and anything like that, even just in modern history, you know, Jews have been driven out of any country they've lived in that hasn't been Israel. Israel is the only state that is for Jews, that is meant for Jews, that is run by Jews, that is inhabited by Jews, that is open to Jews of all backgrounds, religiously or anything else. That state exists for a reason. And to say that the BDS movement only seeks to, you know, put pressure on Israel to give full rights to Palestinians and that's legitimate, I have a hard time accepting that. The BDS movement puts out very misleading information. I find it very hard to take seriously an allegation saying that Israel is an apartheid state when you have Arabs sitting in our Knesset. That's not an apartheid state. Arabs have citizenship here. Arabs that live under Palestinian rule don't because they're living under Palestinian rule. It's misleading, and it has become an easy way for people who are anti-Semitic to claim that they're not and to claim that they're anti-Zionist. You cannot separate the two. Anti-Zionism is anti-Semitism. When you are seeking to delegitimize and wipe away the only Jewish nation in the entire world, that is anti-Semitism. When you have the leaders of the BDS movement, people like Omar Barghouti, saying, yeah, the end means, the end goals of the BDS movement is to wipe Israel off the map, that's anti-Semitism. And I don't see how somebody can take Israel out of Jews. We're one and the same. We're intertwined. You can't make a claim that Israel is illegitimate without claiming that Jews are illegitimate. At the end of the day, Jews are the indigenous people of Israel. It's called Judea. We're from here. You can't make a claim that it belongs to someone else or that somebody else belongs here more than we do. So that's my view on the situation. Attacks like those coming from the BDS movement, attacks like those coming from the ICC, at the end of the day, they're coming from the same place. And that place is to get rid of Israel and get rid of the Jews. Creating a one state, effectively, it gets rid of Israel. And anybody that feels the importance and the need for a Jewish state should recognize that efforts to wipe it off the map are efforts to wipe Jews as we know them off the map. And efforts like that need to be fought against. So that's all from me. If you enjoyed this episode of the Civil Discourse Project, please like and share and follow us on Facebook and YouTube. In a time where civil, respectful conversation like this is getting harder and harder to come by, it's important to promote those ideals, even if we don't disagree with somebody. Even if we do disagree with somebody, I'm sorry, it's still important to respect their opinion, certainly their right to an opinion, and to continue to treat each other with respect. So with that, thank you for joining me. Have a great week.